to Liliana. I first met Liliana back in 2010. She came and helped us track shorebirds and was great at that. And then she went on, she got a PhD. She worked for Alaska Fish and Game for many years, doing subsistence work out in remote Alaska, up in the Arctic and Western Alaska. I think I got that right, Liliana. And so recently, in the last year, she came on with Audubon, Alaska. So her talk tonight is about birds and cranes and Alaska Native cultures. And anybody who knows me knows cranes are near and dear to my heart. And so I'm very excited to hear this talk tonight. So Liliana, and if you want to say anything else about your background, please do.
Thank you, Marianne. That works great. Thank you, everyone, for showing up for birds and cranes and native cultures tonight. I know that's beautiful outside there, and there is a store in the radar screen. So thank you. Tough competition with the good weather outside. Thank you, Marianne, for the invitation, Christina for helping set up, and I'm really happy to be with you here tonight. Let's see if I can get this going. So I'm originally from Brazil. My accent is from Brazilian Portuguese. I first got involved in bird research in Brazil, for example, on feeding ecology of black skimmers. Then I hopped the pond and went to France to get my PhD with black-legged kittiwakes. And I initially came to Alaska for research on kittiwakes on Middleton Island, and I eventually moved in for good about 20 years ago. My work then evolved to combine the natural and social sciences, including research about the kinds and amounts of birds that people harvest, traditional knowledge about birds, and outreach and education. And here on this picture was an interview with elders in the community of Hooper Bay. Indigenous Alaska Native people settled in Alaska thousands of years ago. And since then, Alaska Native people have shared these ecosystems with the birds. They have harvested birds and eggs. They have been paying attention in learning how birds live their lives. Naturally, birds became important food and cultural resources for Alaska Native people, and I will share data and some insights about this relation between people and birds and how wild foods support community well-being. This presentation will cover 4 topics. I will characterize the subsistence way of life in Alaska as a harvest cash mix economy, show data about the harvest of birds in Alaska and the Pacific Flyway, illustrate the importance of birds in the material and intangible culture of Alaska Native peoples, and among about 300 bird species that regularly occur in Alaska, I will highlight the sandhill crane as a culturally salient species across cultures, which is a species that's also commonly harvested. Much of the data that I'll share come from research conducted by the Division of Subsistence of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, where I worked for many years until I joined Audubon, Alaska last year. Native people are a main demographic and cultural part of Alaska. Currently, 22% of Alaska population are native, and this is the highest percentage of native people among all U.S. states. The different color shades on the map represent the traditional native territories or homelands at about the early 1900s and their respective languages. There are 20 native languages in Alaska, which can be grouped into 9 main cultural groups. I would like to show my respect to Alaska Native elders and past and present and future generations. I'm based in Anchorage in the Nine homeland. So about half of the indigenous population live in remote rural communities, which are the blue dots on the map. The green dots are urban communities. There are about 250 rural communities in Alaska, with fewer than 1,000 people. So here on this picture is the post office in the community of Tuksuk Bay. In Alaska, subsistence refers to a way of life centered on fishing, hunting, and gathering. Subsistence is defined in law as the non-commercial, customary, and traditional uses of fish and game for food, clothing, fuel, transportation, construction, art, crafts, sharing, and customary trade. This definition um, derives from the culture and economy of indigenous people and other people who have adopted a similar way of life. Subsistence, in most cases, is not limited to indigenous people, and other Alaska residents may also participate. The most recent estimate for the total harvest of wild resources in Alaska was 3.3 billion pounds per year. Of this total, 98.6% is commercial fishing, 0.9% is commercial fishing and hunting, and 0.5% is other categories of fishing and hunting. Subsistence practices have changed in many ways. Change is part of the human experience and happens for many reasons. An originally nomadic or semi-nomadic way of life was replaced by living in year-long communities. People now use modern harvest gear, aluminum boats, outboard motors, snowmobiles, shotguns, and rifles. The modern living conditions and harvest gear then increased the need for cash and jobs. As compared to the early 1900s, there has been less use of birds as materials, trade products, and also as food. The last generations that they wore bird skin parkas have largely faded. Here is Chester Nangwook from Savunga talking about small and big changes in the subsistence way of life in an interview in 2012. Chester passed away in 2020. In his right hand, Chester showed a snow goose wing broom. In the left hand, he has a store-bought broom. Chester was the mail carrier between Gamble and Savunga. In 1963, he did the very last mail run by dog sled in Alaska, marking the end of an era, with major changes in technology around that time. But subsistence is still is the basis for the economic and social well-being of Alaska remote communities. Research by the Division of Subsistence since the 70s has identified demographic, cultural, and economic elements of the harvest cash mixed economy, which are listed on the screen. As harvest regulations evolved, including those elements has been key to support the well-being of Alaska's rural communities. And I'll talk about some of those elements. So harvest and cash support each other. The cost of living in rural Alaska is very expensive. At the grocery store in Hooper Bay in 2017, this is about 10 years ago, there was almost $8 for half a gallon of milk and 5 for a pound of bananas. So this is clearly outdated, but they still give an idea. As for example, a pound of non-organic banana in Anchorage nowadays is just above $1. Together with the high cost of living in rural Alaska, there are few jobs, and the jobs are often seasonal and low income. So people use cash to buy harvest gear and supplies. Then the harvest yield more and better food than the invested cash would allow to buy. Nowadays, subsistence communities have more access to
Well,
store.
Leanna, we just lost you a second ago.
Okay. On my end here is still all good yet.
I can hear and see you just fine, Lily.
Mm.
I have to have you go back one slide if you could,
Okay, let me
and we'll
see
try
here.
again.
Okay, just a second.
Sorry, turning off your camera and playing video. Hang on just a minute.
Okay,
Oh, it went away. Okay.
let me know when it's back.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, try again.
I'm gonna turn off our camera and see if that helps.
Okay. Would you like to turn off mine here too?
No,
No?
that's fine.
Okay.
Could you back up
Christina,
though,
you-
maybe one slide? She did.
Christina, you
Um,
can put the view into focus on content mode under the view, and that might help.
Let's see.
Oh, Kate, fancy.
We lost Lily.
But we did lose Lily.
No, she's there, we just can't see her.
Sure.
Can you see
I'll
the
ask
slides?
her.
Oh,
Yeah, we see it. Okay.
All right, Lily, go ahead.
Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yeah,
Yes.
bananas and milk.
Okay. Have you heard of the price of bananas and milk?
$1. Yeah.
Unless you're in Hooper Bay. That'd be- Okay. So people use cash to buy harvest gear and supplies, and then harvest yield more and better food than the invested cash would allow people to buy locally. So nowadays, subsistence communities have more access to store-bought foods, but wild foods still are a big part of the diet. This graph shows harvest of wild foods in pounds per person per year in urban communities in red and rural communities in blue. The harvest of wild foods in rural Alaska is 34 million edible pounds per year, and this means 3/4 of a pound per person per day. In rural Alaska, wild foods provided 176% of the daily protein needs and 25% of the daily caloric needs. So wild foods are much healthier and nutritious than the highly processed foods, which make the bulk of the foods usually available at the local stores in rural communities. So replacing the healthy wild foods with the equivalent store-bought foods in rural Alaska would be tremendously expensive. Harvest happens year-round following the seasonal availability of animals and plants. For example, on the Pribilof Islands, the annual cycle of harvest includes fish, marine mammals, birds, and other resources. It's important for subsistence that the regulations allow harvest opportunity when fish, wildlife, and other resources are locally available. People need to know how to harvest and process wild foods. So indigenous knowledge is accumulated over generations by people living in close contact with nature. It's a way of living that blends ecology, geography, history, meteorology, beliefs, and values. Traditional knowledge is embedded in harvesting practices, how people process and store wild foods, in stories, place names, and indigenous languages. Harvesting and sharing wild foods keep the communities together and offer opportunities for young people to learn skills and values. Sharing is a pillar of subsistence economies and a key value in indigenous cultures. Sharing is intrinsically related to harvest activities. Usually, up to 30% of households in a community do most of the harvest. So this graph shows fish harvest in some communities in interior Alaska. So there is cumulative percentage of harvest on the horizontal, on the vertical, and cumulative percentage of households in the horizontal. And here, 23% of the households harvested 70% of the fish. And this pattern is consistent for resources other than fish and other regions of Alaska. So in mainstream Western-derived harvest management, season and bag limits evenly distribute harvest opportunities among individuals. But by research by the Division of Subsistence has shown that individual season and bag limits do not work well for subsistence economies because the high harvest households provide for many households that harvest little or none. Subsistence users harvest hundreds of species of fish, shellfish, land and marine mammals, and birds and their eggs and plants. Maintaining access to a broad diversity of resources is important for food security and to maintain traditional knowledge. In rural Alaska, about half of the harvest is salmon and other fish, followed by land and marine mammals, and these proportions are edible pounds. So birds and eggs, shellfish, and plants are 3 to 4% each. Birds and eggs are a small part of the total, but they are important because traditionally migratory birds and their eggs were and still are harvested when other resources are scarce and especially in the spring. Historically, birds alleviated hunger and starvation. For Alaska Native people, birds and eggs are a survival food from a practical and emotional perspectives. Birds provide the fresh food in the spring after a long winter of preserved foods. Birds and eggs add a diversity to the subsistence diet where many meals are fish. And historically, birds were the source of unique materials such as feathers and down, hollow bones, and beak. So migratory birds move across states and countries in their annual journeys. This means shared stewardship. So migratory routes are grouped into main flyways of continental scale. In Alaska, we have 5 main flyways converging here and bringing birds to breed in summer, and then they spread to many countries in Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas. In North America, bird harvest management and conservation are coordinated within administrative flyways which mirror biological flyways. Alaska belongs to the Pacific Flyway together with the states in the lower 48 that are west of the Rocky Mountains. So in Alaska, there are 2 sets of harvest regulations for migratory birds. One for the spring-summer subsistence season from April to August, and another set of harvest regulations for the general hunting season from September to March. Alaska is the only state in the U.S. with a spring-summer subsistence season for migratory birds. So eligibility to participate in the subsistence harvest is based on region or community of residence. Those are the management regions for the subsistence harvest of migratory birds. There are excluded areas in the urban centers on the red polygons, and the residents of the excluded areas are ineligible to participate in the subsistence harvest of migratory birds. So I'll show some harvest data, and I'll use rural for the subsistence eligible areas, including both spring, summer, and fall, winter harvest. Here there is lots of information and you go by parts. This is harvest in the entire Pacific Flyway, including ducks, geese, swans, and crane. The total harvest, that's the red line there, the bottom line, it's about 3.7 million birds per year. In this graph, the gray color represents harvest in the lower 48. Black is harvest by rural residents, and the yellow is mostly Alaska urban residents. The round graph is the total harvest by region of resident as it refers to the entire Pacific Flyway. So 91% of the harvest in the entire Pacific Flyway is harvest in the lower 48 in fall winter. 7% is year-long harvest by rural Alaska residents. That is the black slice of the pie. And the 2% is mostly harvested by Alaska urban residents in fall, winter. So the graphs are harvest by species. On the top are numbers of birds by species, and on the bottom are proportions of species total. So harvest in the lower 48 includes lots of dabbling ducks. And the harvest in Alaska, especially by rural residents, the black part of the bars, account for large proportions of the harvest of sea ducks and geese in the entire flyway. Here we are looking into the breakdown by region for harvest in Alaska only this time, including migratory and resident birds, ptarmigan and grouse. So harvest in the Yukon Delta is about 1/3 of the total harvest, and this about 140,000 birds per year. The Delta shelters huge number of birds, and this region also has a relatively high human population as compared to other rural regions. So harvest by urban residents about 18%, Bering Strait North and South 11%, interior Alaska 10%, and from there on we are in the single digits as percentiles for the remaining regions. So within Alaska, 45% of the harvest happens in spring, 8% in summer, and 47% in fall winter. Grouse harvest happens mostly in fall winter, and for all the other categories of birds, the seasonality of the harvest roughly follows the general pattern in the pie chart. Okay, this is the last set of pie charts before we start getting dizzy. The breakdown by species category with the birds on the left side and eggs on the right. So ducks and geese are about 3/4 of the total bird harvest, and the composition of the egg harvest is different, where eggs of seabirds account for 78% of the total. Crane accounts for 1% of the number of birds and eggs harvested. And just ahead, I will show crane harvest in more detail. In the late 1800s through the early 1900s, bird populations in North America were decimated by commercial hunting. People were using these kinds of artillery to shoot at bird flocks. Crane populations were nearly exterminated together with other birds. So the scarcity of birds led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 that prohibited commercial hunting and set the hunting closure during the breeding season. But by that time, there was already large-scale habitat loss due to large-scale agriculture and other human uses. So habitat loss further contributed to bird population declines and slowed population recovers. For decades, many or most hunting for crane was closed because populations were too small. This picture is from the early 1900s. I don't know if this was commercial or non-commercial use, but I just meant to illustrate crane hunting in general with historical and geographical continuity. So this other picture is on Middleton Island in the Gulf of Alaska in the early 1900s. Here is on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta sometime in the 70s through the early 90s. In South Central Alaska in 2013, Andy in the picture is my husband. We were so grateful for having a crane for Thanksgiving that year. This other picture is in the Bristol Bay region in 2010. So here are numbers of crane harvest in the Pacific Flyway. So in recent decades, crane populations have increased due to conservation and recovery efforts, additional foods provided by agricultural crops as waste grain in the lower 48. Some hunting opportunities have been reinstalled. The total harvest of sandhill crane in the entire Pacific Flyway is 7,000 birds per year and 1,300 eggs per year. So as a reference, harvest in the Central Flyway, not shown on these numbers there on the screen, is about 60,000 cranes per year, only on the Central Flyway. So harvest in rural Alaska is about 3/4 of the total crane harvest in the Pacific Flyway. 53% of the crane harvest happens in the spring, summer, and 46% in the fall, winter. Birds and other animals are integral to indigenous peoples and their culture. Cultural resources include the material and intangible resources. Material culture are things like food, tools, clothing, sculpture, paintings, buildings, and etc. The intangible resources are things like worldviews, values, language, education, stories, place names, music, and dance. Material and intangible are intertwined. I will refer broadly to birds in indigenous cultures and some topics specific about cranes. So here again are the traditional indigenous homelands and languages. As much as possible, let's try to keep a mental picture, or at least the idea that they are red in the middle and blue on the edge there for groups of languages. And the researchers of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology used eBird data to estimate the seasonal abundance of sandhill crane across its range. So red is distribution during the breeding season, yellow is spring and fall migration, blue is non-breeding season, and purple is year-round for non-migratory populations. So sandhill cranes that breed in Alaska winters in the Pacific and the mid-continent areas. So zooming the abundance map into Alaska and overlapping indigenous languages, these are the names for cranes in some indigenous languages and dialects. The font colors match colors in the language map. So indigenous people commonly speak English, but still use mostly bird names in their native language. All indigenous groups in Alaska have a long history of coexistence with crane, dating back thousands of years. So crane as an individual species feature prominently in Alaska Native cultures. It's a large bird with a unique appearance, voice, and behaviors. So for comparison, loons are also prominent in Alaska Native cultures. But with 5 species of loons in Alaska, it's often difficult to figure out if references to loons in Alaska Native cultures apply to individual species and if individual species from a biological perspective would matter for a cultural perspective. Sometimes it do. For example, yellow-billed loons have their own place among all the loons in Alaska Native cultures, especially in the northern areas. But there is no look-alike species for crane, except in southern and southeast Alaska, where the blue heron also occurs. So for the most part, references to crane are largely unambiguous in Alaska Native ethnotaxonomy, stories, place names, and material culture. Beyond nutrition for the physical body, wild foods are central to indigenous culture, values, and spirituality. Indigenous values include connection to the land, learning from the land, acquiring and transferring traditional knowledge, the importance of elders as knowledge and culture bearers, sharing, no waste, and respect for harvest animals, and wild foods are directly involved with all these key values. Birds historically provided unique materials. A particular bone in cranes' feet or the lower leg was used to make needles. Sometimes crane flight feathers were used in arrow fletching. Wing bones of cranes and swans were used as spear thrower. The crane's bill is used as an arrowhead, and feathers and other bill parts are still used in decoration, handicrafts, and regalia. There are many stories about crane with multiple examples within cultural groups, and it seems some of these stories also extend across cultural groups. Crane voice and behavior are traditionally associated with singing and dancing. It's possible or likely that there are different songs and dances about crane. There is a particular way to interact with cranes, which has been documented across indigenous groups from Western Alaska to Canada. So cranes are wary, but if people find themselves close to cranes, people sing and dance, people sing for cranes to dance. So Herbert Brent is an ornithologist who did bird research and collections in Hooper Bay in the early 40s, witnessed such an interaction. And I read from his book, Alaska Bird Trails. That was that expedition that Brent went with Aulos Murray and other people to Hooper Bay. So here is what he explained about this encounter with cranes. So we had drawn the kayak up along the nest, and one of the Eskimo boys now removed a blunt bird arrow from its tongued place. With this, he began to beat the tightly drawn sealskin deck of the boat so as to produce the only native instrumental music. The both boys chanted their dreamy crane song, accompanied by the rhythmic tom-tom beating of their improvised drum. When the boys beat their drum and sang faster, the dancers moved more quickly, and when the music slower, the birds seemed to do likewise. This continued for perhaps 10 minutes, while I stood spellbound. It was to me one of the most entrancing as well one of the most novel bird experiences that I enjoyed while in the North. Furthermore, this was perhaps the only occasion on which a bird couple danced an ornithologist out of a very acceptable set of eggs, for after witnessing that a rare entertainment, I had not the heart to disturb their attractive nursery. So bird singing and dancing and their breeding displays are a joyful part of the soundscape. In spring, the arrival of migratory birds is a special event for northern indigenous peoples and a reliable sign that the long winter is coming to an end. I will play the audio of a quote from an interview.
I love the tundra and higher suns. I go there. It brings you back to health and when it comes alive on the tundra. But I was in the woods last couple of weeks, and there's 3 different kinds of birds I've seen, and this not including the snow bunting. And I said, oh, we still have them, because when they leave, I always say goodbye to them and come again. My grandmother said the same thing. I didn't know her, but my sister told me. And then some other where I read do the same thing because we miss them when they're gone.
This was Grace Anaver for Quinnahac. So in the Yukon and Kuskokwim Delta and Bristol Bay regions, the old Yupik dance masks represented traditional worldviews. Traditional Yupik worldviews center on the understanding that animals and other non-human beings are aware or sentient and they decide how to interact with people based on human thought and deed. So animals may allow themselves to be harvested if people have the correct intentions, if they show respect and follow protocols. So there are special powers and objects, such as amulets and masks, that enable people to change form, to communicate with non-human beings, and to see and travel into other worlds. And the shamans facilitated relations between worlds, including medicines for diseases which were perceived as imbalance in such relations. Into the first decades of the 1900s, Yupik people held a cycle of communal ceremonies or festivals during fall and winter. The festivals included sharing food and gifts as social functions, honoring deceased people, thanking and honoring harvest animals, and requesting for an abundance. So there was one festival that was called the Bladder Festival, celebrated in early winter, whose primary function was to thank and please the souls of animals killed in the previous harvest season. Then complementary, there was another festival celebrated in late winter that was called Alayohak, whose primary purpose was to elicit an abundant harvest in the upcoming harvest season. So Alayohak means way of requesting or praying for abundance. Alayohak was characterized by masked dances, singing, and drumming to appeal to the spirits represented in the masks. Preparing for Alayohak, the shamans directed the creation of masks that represented the spirits of animals, helping spirits, visions, and encounters between worlds. Pairs or trios of masks accompanied a particular song and dance to tell a story, and each mask corresponded to the verse of a song. The masks are also carved for telling humorous stories and are just for practice, but most often the masks were powerful objects intended to facilitate communication with non-human beings and to request abundant harvest. And the dance masks were usually destroyed or discarded after use. Starting in the mid-1800s, the Yupik communities were devastated by outbreaks of new diseases brought by Euro-American settlers. Shamans died and fell into distrust as they were unable to alleviate such widespread mortality. And at the same time, missionaries forbade the masked dances while imposing Euro-American religions. Medical professionals brought new health programs in the context of missionary activities, and by the 30s, Yupik shamanism and the masked dances had faded in most communities. So the accession or record notes for this set of masks say, mask representing a crane that carried sick medicine man to his home. And there is the medicine man, it's on the belly of the cranes. Each mask has a human-like Iwa face, and Iwa means its person. A Iwa face represents the spirit of the mask or of the being represented in the mask. In general, an upturned mouth is interpreted as representing a male entity and a downturned mouth as a female entity. And you can see this on the set of masks. So the mask with the upturned mouth is at the Fenimore Art Museum at Copperstone, New York. And the mask with the downturned mouth, it's here in Anchorage at the Anchorage Museum. The set also includes a third crane figure that was stuck on the ground when the crane mask was used. So this ornament is also at the Anchorage Museum, and it's such a great opportunity to have those objects here in Anchorage. This mask also said to represent the Iwa of a crane. The maker was a shaman who claimed that at once, when he was alone upon the tundra, he saw a sinecure crane standing at a distance looking at him. And as he approached, the feathers on the bird's breast parted, revealing the face of the bird's Iwa. So mask sets were often separated at the time of collection or later at the museums and private collections. Most often, the old Yupik masks are depicted and displayed individually without a reference to their song, story, or other masks in the set. In the 90s, Fiona Priorgan, working with the Yupik cultural bearers, made enormous progress in understanding the meaning of the old dance masks and identifying sets of masks. Their book, A Way of Making Praying, still is the main reference depicting sets of old Yupik dance masks. But the process through which shamanism was replaced by Western religions left little opportunity to recover the lore of the masked dances, their stories, songs, dances, iconography, their visual images and symbols and meaning. So much about the specifics, stories, and meanings of dance mask remains unretrievable. Indigenous people remained spiritually connected to the land and the animals despite the social, economic, and religious changes. The dances reemerged in the 50s and 60s, but without masks. People just decided that without the shamans, there was no process for creating the masks. In recent decades, the masks have been carved as art and for sale. The modern masks keep ties with the past and incorporate new influences and materials. Masks have become icons of a broad cultural revival and healing. So in the dances, men hold fans with the feathers in both hands. The feathers amplify the movements of arms and hands. Traditionally, snowy owl and swan feathers are the material of choice for the men's dance fans. The feathers are held by a ring of twisted grass. But people adapted to new materials and conditions, and these fans from the 70s have the traditional snowy owl feathers but are held by plastic coffee can lids. For Alaska Native peoples, birds are messengers. Birds alert people about weather, the arrival of other animals, conditions for traveling, and things to happen in their lives. Native people pay attention to unusual bird behaviors. So a small bird landing on a person takes away illness. If a bird repeatedly flies over a village, someone will die. Birds that give bad news are not bad themselves, they just show what is in the future. So birds provide information because they know what is going on and behave or respond accordingly. And getting information for birds involves paying attention and know how birds live their lives. For example, in the winter, ptarmigan with a very full crop indicates a coming storm. So they eat a lot and they seek shelter by burrowing themselves in the snow. And of course, to learn that and to be able to forecast the weather like that, you need to kill the ptarmigan. So small birds are the focus of children learning to hunt. As children learn, they move on to larger animals and more powerful hunting tools. So this picture is from the 40s on Sonoras Island when kids used bow and arrow and slingshot. Nowadays, children usually start hunting with BB guns. Let then list a quote from an interview that talks about the learning process for becoming a hunter.
When I was growing up, I used a little bow and arrow and slingshot, and like David and Goliath, that sling, you put rock in it, you swirl it around, and you let the rock go. Those were my weapons or my hunting tools. And it teaches a child on how to stalk a bird, without spooking it. And you try to get as close to as possible. That's a challenge. Because if you try to shoot it from far off, you'll just, when the rock lands next to it, it'll just spook it. So it teaches you patience to get to the bird. It teaches you how to crawl, if you need to crawl, or stoop down, or hide behind a knoll. It teaches you those skills.
That was an interview with John Mark from Quinnahock.
When I was growing
Oops. So those birds on the top left, found in archaeological sites, are pieces for a dice game carved from walrus teeth. And this game is perhaps at the origin of modern bird ivory carvings produced for sale, the ones at the bottom. These grass baskets have been puzzling for me as they are decorated with feet from rather small birds, not the kinds of large birds that you see more in the harvest surveys nowadays, like ducks and geese. Why did the weaver use bird feet? And as I usually don't think about bird feet as decoration. But so learning and appreciating cultural diversity may take initiative from us as an individuals to ask such questions. What are people are doing out there hunting? Why should you care if people are hunting or not? So besides harvest management and bird conservation, these questions are also about cultural diversity, different worldviews, different ways of knowing. So the subsistence cultures and other cultures more connected with nature offer us opportunities to think about our relations with animals, nature, and food. So despite differences, they are common ground, and we all learn from each other, and this makes our individual lives better. Thank you for having me tonight, and it has been a pleasure to be with you here. Thank you. And I think I'll stop sharing.
Does anybody have questions? Just raise your hand and speak up. For questions?
I got a comment.
Sure, go ahead, Pete.
So on the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta, I worked on my PhD, studying geese primarily. But you were never out of sight or sound of a sandhill crane. And when James Fisher and Roger Torrey Peterson were out there in 1954, I want to say, Jack Paniak from Shevac was working for Fish and Wildlife Service later on, but he was out there, and James Fisher said, "I'll give you $20 if you can run down a sandhill crane." And some of them molt enough flight feathers that they can't quite fly. So somehow Jack found one of these birds. He ran it down and gave it to Fisher, and he got $20, which now is worth like $200 at least. Major form of income. And I had a chance to run one down once. And I had some bands with me. So I ran it down. I probably ran for 350 or 400 yards. And I caught it, and I was holding it with my right arm around the body. And I was wearing a duck hunter's hat, that's got a pretty wide and actually a 4-layer brim around it. And I kind of looked away, I think, and the crane reared back and went bam, right into the side of that hat. And I had just a horrible headache.
Yeah.
If it had missed me, it would have killed me for sure. And I thought, I'm going to wring its neck, not its leg. But I held back, and I got the band, and I put it on the bird, and I let it go. I don't know if it was ever recovered or not, but that's my story of sandhill cranes.
This is the kind of thing that cranes do, and the kind of thing that Jack Paniak would do. So thanks for sharing the story.
Are there any other questions or comments? Well, thank you, Liliana. That was really good. Very, very interesting. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lily.
Thank you so much. And
She'll be at the Shorebird Festival speaking Saturday night.